By this point, you should be focusing on ordering investigations and writing prescriptions. You need to get up to speed. Okay guys, story time. This video is about the GP who humiliated me in front of a patient. Yes, it's a true story. Yes, some of you might recognize the title from a blog post I've written 6 or 7 months ago. Shout out to everyone who's followed the blog since day one. I thought it'd be really fun to tell the story in the format of a YouTube video, and a lot of people had actually asked for that, so today, here it is. So in the summer of 2017, I just finished my integrated BSc year at medical school, and I was about to enter my 4th clinical year. Now, as most medical students can probably relate, coming off a summer break can make you a little rusty. And coming off an entire year of studying something completely different can take you a while to get back in the swing of things. And my first rotation was in general practice. So I had pre-selected a GP practice that wasn't too far from my home, and I was going to be there for the next 6 weeks or so. So my first day, I had a very chilled introduction by one of the receptionists who showed me how the computer system worked, and then my GP supervisor, who I was going to be shadowing for the next few weeks, told me that I'd sit in with him and I might even see some patients independently that day. I was like, okay, getting straight into it, cool. And I sit with him for maybe 2 patients max before he says, okay, let's go next door. And he picks up a briefcase full of medical tools and he drops me off in the consultation room next door. And the bag's got things like, you know, a stethoscope, air thermometer, tongue depressor, basic tools like that. So things are moving a bit quickly, but by this point I was thinking, okay, I'm sitting on a super comfy chair, and every patient I see, he's going to see straight afterwards and review them. So what's the worst that could happen? So I'll call in my first patient, take a history, quick examination, I'm thinking of my differentials now, and then I document my findings on the computer system and send the GP a quick notification just to let him know that once he's finished with his patient, to come over and review my plan. He comes around a few minutes later and he looks at my plan, he asks the patient a couple other questions, and then he looks at me and says, okay, fine. So we end the consultation, the patient leaves, and the GP heads back to his consultation room. The exact same thing happens again and again and again. Before I start thinking to myself, wait a minute, this guy hasn't told me off yet. He hasn't told me what I've missed, he hasn't told me what to improve. He just gave me this nod of approval after every patient I saw, and he'd either say okay or fine or good. And there's no way that was because I was doing everything perfectly, because I know for a fact that I wasn't. I may have been safe and sensible, but my structure was almost always off, and I'd always forget to ask a couple of questions. But he never called me out on it once. He would just occasionally ask them himself when he came in. Now I appreciate that he didn't critique me in front of the patients, that's always good etiquette, but at the same time, there's always a moment where the patient leaves where he could have given me some constructive criticism in private. After all, I was there to learn and he was there to facilitate that learning. But I carried on without complaint, because who would I be to complain about feeling too comfortable, right? Anyway. A week or so goes by and I'm starting to get used to this routine. Things are running smoothly, I'm going for lunch on time, there's a nice Turkish restaurant on the high street, life's good. But one day I come in and this GP is not in. The receptionist tells me that I'm going to be sitting in with a different GP instead of my usual. So I'm standing outside this new GP's door, I'm waiting for the consultation to end. When the patient leaves, I walk in and I introduce myself. He says something like, okay, you been there before? Know how things work? Okay, sit in that room opposite and start seeing patients. I'm thinking, okay, this guy's a bit blunt, but I've been there for a while and I knew how things worked, so I just sat in the room opposite and I did exactly that. Okay, so if you can imagine, our rooms are placed opposite down a small corridor, so when we're seated, he can occasionally keep an eye on what I'm doing. So I call in my first patient. It's a teenage boy, maybe 16, 17 years old, and he's there with his mum, and already I'm starting to get my first signs of the mother-son dynamic. The mum is constantly on edge, trying to speak on behalf of her son, and he's sitting there with a stern face and constantly correcting what she's saying, and you can just tell that he doesn't really want her to be there. She explains that he's had some recent behavioural change and that he's become a lot more aggressive recently, at which point he shouts at her and asks her to leave the room and let him finish the consultation alone. And she does exactly that. Now, I didn't realise how prevalent mental health and psychological issues were in the community, but I'd already seen my fair share over the past weeks, and all I knew was that in these kind of situations, you need some solid communication. But luckily, as medical students, we're actually protected by the fact that there's always going to be a senior doctor who's going to come in and review the patient after us, who's going to make a final plan, and who's going to sweep up any mess that we've basically made during our consultation. So I'm relatively relaxed. I'm having a heart-to-heart with this boy, I'm building rapport, gaining his trust, and trying to show him that I'm genuinely interested in an outcome that would satisfy both of us. And he lets his guard down and the conversation starts moving in the right direction. Now, with anyone who presents with this notion of character change, one of the most basic medical approaches is to rule out neurological causes before assuming it's psychiatric in nature. One extreme example is that somebody might even have a brain tumor which is causing them to behave differently. So you need to rule out these sorts of things before you start thinking somebody has a mental illness. And in order to rule these things out, you need to ask questions, you need to perform basic neurological examinations, etc. Now, I was super rusty with my neurological examinations, so I thought it'd be a good idea to call in the GP and run through it together with him so that we'd only have to do it on him once. Now, I probably knew enough to give it a good shot, but at the same time, as I mentioned earlier, I had just come off a year where I wasn't doing clinical medicine, so my confidence in doing it well was a bit low. So I signaled the GP to come in. Now he walks in, I tell him my plan. He says, no, do it yourself. You should know how to do it by now. Suddenly he storms out as if to say, I'll come back when you're really finished. Now I'm sitting behind a desk and a screen against the wall, and if you can imagine, the patient is sort of sitting diagonal from me against that same wall. So I tilt the screen away from him so that he can't see that I'm loading up geekymedics.com, which is basically a resource that teaches you to do what I'm about to do, okay? My UK students will know. So I'm slowly refreshing my memory until seconds later, the door opens. The GP is suddenly in the middle of the room again. He came in so quickly, I didn't even have enough time to do that quick exit click thing, and so my website is still open and I am dying inside. So now this GP's eyes are fixated on me and he's saying, go on, do it. And I have no clue whether or not he's aware of what's going down on the screen or if he's just choosing not to pay attention to it. So I start slowly going through the examination. Can you feel me there? Can you feel me there? 30 seconds in, he signals to me to get out the way and he whizzes through the examination and asks some question. There, done. What year are you in? Year 4. This should be your bread and butter. By this point, you should be focusing on ordering investigations and writing prescriptions. You need to get up to speed. So this GP has basically just humiliated me in front of this patient who's been watching the entire thing like... The GP then leaves us to wrap up the consultation, and as soon as he shuts the door behind him, I can't even stare this patient in the face as if I'd just been exposed as a fraud or something. And then the patient breaks the silence. It's alright, it happens, mate. This guy was now consoling me. Yeah, you can't make this up. So that was the end of that, and I can't exactly remember what happened afterwards. Maybe because my brain had erased it because of trauma, I don't know. But it's not quite the end of the story. The following days, I couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. Not because of the fact that it had rattled me a little bit, but because of how differently I was treated by that GP compared to the first one. And interestingly enough, around this time, I just so happened to be getting into self-development books. Basically, I had recently given my first attempt at a business, so I was really in the groove of listening to these audiobooks. Shout out Audible for not sponsoring this video. And one new concept that I had kept running into was this idea of a growth mindset, which was basically the idea that you need to put yourself in uncomfortable situations in order to grow, in order to be better, and in order to push past those plateaus. And I'm thinking to myself at this point, the second GP made me feel really uncomfortable. Not to the point where I wanted to cry or something, but enough to make me want to do better. And generally, I have thick skin and I'm the type of person who might actually benefit from a shock to the system like that was every now and again. So this one thought came into my head: should I be spending more time with the second GP than the first one? After all, the old one wasn't teaching me anything new. Yes, he made me feel comfortable, but I knew for a fact that I wasn't growing or becoming a better doctor under his supervision. It takes time, energy, and someone to care, even if it's the smallest amount, to give you criticism. Now, unless it's a straight up attack on you, most times when someone gives you criticism, it takes mental energy to have to observe you, process what you're doing, calculate the gaps and where you can improve, and then care enough to tell you, despite the fact that it's super uncomfortable telling someone you barely even know that they can do better. Deep down, surely they must care even the smallest amount if they're willing to make a change in you, even if they handle it in the worst possible way. So if somebody didn't care about you at all, they wouldn't go through any of that, just like the first GP did. And so my mindset had completely shifted in the way that I viewed these two interactions. A few years prior to this, I would have went straight back to the old GP like the next day and tried to chase that feeling of comfort again. Instead, I turned up to that second GP's room the very next day and I said, "Can I shadow you some more?" And he gave me this nod of approval as if to say he respected me for coming back. As though I had understood that while his old school methods weren't the best, I appreciated the benefit in them. He said, "Don't worry, by the end of this placement we'll have you slick at everything." And so he took me under his wing, and over the remainder of my time there, he had me engaged in every consultation. He put me in the hot seat multiple times, and he taught me more than I had learned throughout my entire time with the first GP. And so the lesson is this: if you feel comfortable in doing what you do, you're not growing. And sometimes the person who makes you feel the most uncomfortable may be your best teacher. Now, I'm in no way excusing any actions that shouldn't be tolerated, but what I am saying is that sometimes we run away from people or experiences that challenge us and make us feel inadequate. That makes us feel uncomfortable, so naturally we shift towards something that makes us feel more comfortable. And what I'm saying is, every now and again, try to endure that challenge and see what you get out from it. Some of life's best teachers don't just turn up at your doorstep. You have to actively seek them out and stick with them. What I challenge you to do is to face some of those people and experiences that make you feel uncomfortable and ask yourself, what can I gain from this? How can I grow from this? At the very least, you'd be learning how to deal with stress, uncomfortable communication, and handling people that you disagree with. And on the other end, you might accelerate your learning and achieve things that you never thought you would have achieved if you stayed in your comfort zone. So now I constantly find myself asking, am I feeling too comfortable? If I am, then I know that I need to change that. And I think that you should give it a try too. Thank you for listening. If you made it this far, please like the video and subscribe if you haven't already. I'm going to leave a link to that original blog post in the description below, and I will see you next week. Bye.